Hey everyone, I hope all of you are doing well today. In today's PowerPoint, we're going to be talking about the role that genetics and genes overall play in our own behaviors. So to start off with, we have a video here that I would like you guys to watch. It has two university professors talking about the role that genetics play in behavior. I think it's a good it'll give you a good bit of background knowledge before we get into the main part of today's lesson. So to start off with, we're going to go into a little bit of background context. And in actuality, this topic is actually quite controversial for a few reasons. Um, it was largely used as a basis to argue that some races were genetically more fit than others. For instance, eugenics was used by the Nazis and by other groups to uh, try to spin a case that some people were quote unquote mentally defective and that some people were part of a master race. Of course, these are, you know, I don't use the word disproven often, but this has been disproven. They were also the basis for some Jim Crow laws in America, including bans on interracial marriage. And so to talk about genetics and behavior is to talk about a topic in which we have thankfully in the psychological community and science community learned a lot more about the basis for how genetics influence our behaviors on a day-to-day basis. Because in the end, what we found is that behavior is mostly overcome by the individual's environment, their decisions, and other factors. Our genetic code does not absolutely define us, but it does influence us. And that's going to be an important point we're going to be talking about today. So within this, our discussions overall on the unit of biological psychology um, is this strong idea of nature versus nurture. And nature refers to biology, as I'm doing in my best writing. And then nurture is the people around us, okay, and our environment. And so when we talk about the idea of nature versus nurture, it's really been a debate that has gone throughout science in terms of what guides our behavior more, biology or environment. And so what we've often found is that it is an integration of both. Biology influences our environment, and environment influences our biology. Now, genetics, again, does not determine your behavior 100% of the time. Often, though, it becomes a mitigating factor, or a mitigating factor between genetics and behavior is our environment. We're going to be talking in the next lecture about twin studies and adoption studies. And what they have often shown is that individuals with identical genetic codes can turn out to be very different based on how they are socialized and the environments that they are presented with. Even things like stress in your environment can change whether a gene becomes apparent in your behavior. And this is of great interest to scientists. We want to know the factors through which we could sort of either predict behavior or help change behaviors, especially negative behaviors. And over time, we've started to identify specific genes related to behavior. And so we don't have to rely as much on twin or adoption studies as we did in the past. Now, there are two ways in which they've studied or used correlation studies between genes and behavior. because we couldn't necessarily just experiment on changing someone's genetic code. That wouldn't be ethical. The first one are GXE correlations, or gene environment correlations. And then the other one are endophenotypes. And if one has a genetic variation making them more susceptible to things like obesity, depression, anxiety, alcoholism, then environments may bring on an expression of those genes. In the end, even though we cannot control everything in our environment, in the end, our environment can help determine those things. But we can overcome, whether addiction runs in someone's family or aggression or anger runs in someone's family. You can put yourself in different environments. You can grow and change in ways that help you to avoid some of those pitfalls. Now, in the end, genes cannot affect behavior unless they are expressed. There are things within our genetic code that never get expressed. Two siblings could each have a gene for alcoholism, for instance, and neither of them ever express it, or both of them express it, or one of them expresses it. And what we've also learned is that genes are not the direct cause of most complex behaviors. In the end, genes must interact with the environment in some way, and life events help shape those behaviors. And so in the end, I talked about nature versus nurture before, but it's more like nature and nurture. They both interact with each other. They both work with each other to, in some ways, affect our lives and influence our lives. So this is just a quote here about genes and behavior, and I just wanted to show you this, but it says the quest for genetic explanations of why we do what we do more accurately reflects the desire for hard certainties about frightening social problems than the true complexities of human affairs. And that's really the basis for why so many people are so interested in this. We want hard, fast answers for why these negative things happen in society, but sometimes a simple answer is not enough. That would be too reductionist. That would be too simplified. And so sometimes we have to be okay with answers that are somewhat in the middle. All right, so just a few terms when talking about genetics, but a gene, as I'm sure you are aware of from science class, is a unit of heredity that is transferred from a parent to offspring and is held to determine some characteristic of the offspring. And this is made up of DNA, which provides the blueprint for the structure and function of the human body, which in our case, and what we're interested in, with behavior. All right, so when taking the complete set of genes within one living organism, you would take what is called a genome. So these are all the genes again in one human, and the human genome contains about 25,000 different genes. And what scientists have already done have identified several million different variations, or what are called polymorphisms, of those genes. So these are probably responsible for the physical and mental health problems as they interact with the environment and other genes to affect behavior. And that's why there's such wild variations even within the same family who share a very, very similar genetic code. And what they found, and why it's so difficult to sort of map out everything and to take into context all the different variations, is that it takes years to study just one polymorphism. And the goals of studying these different variations are to make people more resilient to environmental stressors. Because again, environment becomes the, most mitigating factor in whether a gene is expressed or not. And in the end, people with specific polymorphisms can be matched to specific prevention programs or even particular drug treatments. Now, again, this is an ideal experience, and technology has not, sort of gotten to that point as of yet, to having that be successful in all cases. All right, so the first type of correlation study with genes that we talked about was the gene environment correlation, or GXE. So these show how a genetic risk can make one sensitive to the environment. They investigate the effect of genes on behavior that might not be seen unless the study is designed to see the different environments in which genes are expressed. And like we talked about, people with similar environments can have different responses. So genes are important, and scientists can show how they interact with environmental factors while also influencing behavior. So the main gene we're going to be talking about today is one called 5-HTT. And 5-HTT deals with depression and serotonin transporting. And so some argue that short alleles of the 5-HTT gene, or the serotonin transporter gene, as it's also known, increase one's sensitivity to stress, which then increases the risk for depression. They're still trying to discover whether there is enough evidence to support this, but a lot of studies have sort of continued to, in some ways, confirm those findings. So the 5-HTT gene, these are used in research about genetic risks for depression. It's now used as a model for studying other polymorphisms and behavior. And the two short alleles in particular are signs, and that's what SS means, in particular are signs of predisposition to depression. And so what they do is look at certain polymorphisms. They look at environmental factors and see how that relates to one's risk for depression. So genetic vulnerability, though, for this particular gene to depression is related again to stress, and whether these are interfering with the promoter region of that particular gene. And so it could lead to lower rates of serotonin and therefore a higher chance of depression. All right, now looking at a risk model, and a risk model is used to illustrate how additional stressors might impact one's chances of having a mental illness. And sometimes they look at individual people. So that's why everyone would have a different risk model. But the risk of depression increases if again, two short alleles are present in genetic code. There's a life stressor like losing a job, family issues, work issues over and above losing a job, and the risk continues to increase as the number of stressful events grow. But the risk of depression can decrease if there's two long alleles. Even in the same environmental situations, someone with two long alleles has been correlated with having a much lower chance of depression, even given the same life events. And so that's one way in which genetics can sort of influence behavior. And if you have two short alleles and you live a less stressful life, or you have found ways to sort of combat stress in your life, that may lead to lower chances for developing depression. So the first study here today is from a study called CASPI et al. It's from 2003. So they wanted to see the correlation between genetic type of having one short and one long allele, two short alleles or two long alleles of the 5-HTT gene with responses on questionnaires about stressful life events. And so we've talked about this potentially in the past, but they took 847 white people or Caucasian people from New Zealand, all 26 years old, and they were placed into one of three groups based on their allele pair type, a quasi-experiment, and or correlation study as well. So they filled out a life history survey with questions about life events. There was no difference found in the amount of stressors from particular participants of the three groups. It's not like those with two short alleles had much more stressful lives than those with two long alleles, but they diagnosed 17% of the surveyed for depression. And the data was analyzed with correlations between depression symptoms, genotypes, stressful events, and their interactions. And what they found was that participants with the two short alleles had a greater risk of depression after 4 or more stressful events over a period of 5 years. Death of a parent, losing a job, having to move, having kids, all of these major life events can bring stress, whether in the long run they are good or bad. They are still something to get used to. Participants with the two long alleles and the same number of stressful events had a much lower risk of depression occurring. And so reports of low stress environments predicted lower rates of depression regardless of their genotype. And so, what they find is that gene 5-HTT does affect depression greatly, but only as it interacts with the stressful environment. And this is part of a large number of studies, 40 independently run studies, that the S allele influences the way that people react to stress. The other study here is Berry, KOCHANSKA, and PHILBERT from 2008. And this is also studying the 5-HTT gene. And this has also suggested a reason for why some children are more at risk for developing insecure attachment. And attachment refers to the connection between, any two people really, but in particular here, the parent and the child relationship. And so an insecure attachment for a child would be that you're uncertain that the parent is available or willing to give comfort. And so the aim of this was to see the influence of these two short alleles on the 5-HTT gene. So what they did was they genotyped parents and children, and they evaluated children for attachment behaviors at 7 and 15 months based on a theory or model called Ainsworth's pattern of attachment. And so the results were infants with the two short alleles of the 5-HTT gene had a greater risk of developing insecure attachment by 15 months if the mother was also unresponsive to their needs. And so there's an influence between the genetic code or the genome and, the genotype and the environment. Infants with the two short alleles but who had responsive mothers, much less likely to develop insecure attachment. And so a child's development in these cases really is the result of a complex interplay. You must have both factors for them as individuals genetically, but you must also take into account their environment, what is going on around them. All right, so endophenotypes are the other type of correlation study done with genetics and behavior. And this is taking a behavior one wants to study and relating it to a phenotype or a variation, as we talked about, that is related to a polymorphism. So a phenotype, a set of characteristics or traits resulting from a genotype interacting with the environment. And we don't have a study on this, but endophenotypes have been used in terms of studies on alcoholism. And genes we've found have accounted for 40 to 60% of the factors contributing to alcoholism. And when genes interact with the environment, the risk for alcoholism increases. So one researcher named Marv Shuckett identified 4 different phenotypes with alcoholism. So the first one was a low response to alcohol. So if you are someone who is starting to drink and you have the first couple drinks and you really don't feel anything, you're more likely to continue drinking. And what that does is that your tolerance goes up, and you're more likely to stop, or sorry, less likely to stop early on in drinking. The next one is facial flushing. Another one, personality characteristics such as impulsiveness. If you're more likely to take risks, you're probably more likely to continue being okay with the risks associated with drinking more alcohol. And then also psychiatric disorders such as major depression, PTSD, panic disorders, antisocial personality disorder, schizophrenia. Sometimes alcoholism or alcohol has been used as a medication for it, and is overused instead of more helpful and productive and positive outsources for those behaviors. All right, with that being said, we're going to continue talking about genes and behavior next time when we talk about genetic similarities in behavior. So we're going to want to continue deepening our understanding for what this means. Like always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and I hope you all have a great day.